The air in Miller's marvelous bakes, once a comforting, tangible hug of sugar, yeast, and melting butter, now felt painfully thin, a ghost of its former self. For Diane Miller, the scent of her own creations had become the scent of absence. It had been 3 long months since David's heart had simply, cruelly given out on an ordinary Tuesday morning, leaving a void shaped exactly like her husband of 35 years. He had been the bakery's foundation, the sturdy columns supporting the beautiful arches of her craft. David was the numbers, the logistics, the booming, infectious laugh that greeted every single customer by name. Diane was the artist, the alchemist, whose hands knew the precise moment a brioche dough had been kneaded into silken submission, whose palate could detect a single missing grain of cinnamon in a batch of 200 morning buns. But their art had always been a duet. Without David's steady rhythm, her melody felt lost and discordant. Every morning, the pre-dawn ritual that once filled her with purpose now felt like a punishment. The familiar click of the heavy lock on the front door echoed with a hollow finality in the quiet of Main Street. She'd tie on her flour-dusted apron, the one David had proudly presented to her for their 10th anniversary, its blue fabric now soft and faded, and force herself to face his desk. It was a mountain of malevolent paper. Invoices, tax forms, payroll stubs, vendor contracts, city permits. It was a foreign language she'd never needed to learn, and now she was drowning in it. The numbers swam before her tear-filled eyes, taunting her with their cold, unforgiving logic. Just last week, she'd tried to place the weekly supply order, a task David had handled with effortless ease. She'd spent 2 hours on the phone, confused by terms like net 30 and minimum order quantity, and ended up ordering 20 pounds of cake flour instead of the bread flour they desperately needed. The mistake sat in the storeroom, a monument to her incompetence. Defeated, she would retreat to the kitchen, the one place that still felt like hers. She sought solace in the rhythmic thud of the industrial stand mixer and the enveloping warmth of the commercial ovens. But even here, his absence was a constant, aching presence. He wasn't there to sneak a warm, flaky croissant from the cooling rack, his eyes twinkling as he declared it a vital act of quality control. He wasn't there to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as she decorated a birthday cake, his chin resting on her shoulder. The bakery, once a vibrant hub of the community, felt muted. The line that used to snake out the door on Saturday mornings was shorter now. The cheerful chatter of regulars had been replaced by hushed, sympathetic tones. They saw her grief, her struggle, and it made them hesitant. It was during one of these moments of paralytic despair, a stack of red-stamped, past-due supplier bills clutched in her hand, that David's younger brother Richard had appeared. He was a vision of control in a world of chaos, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit and polished leather shoes that seemed to repel the ambient flour dust. He placed a gentle, cool hand on her shoulder. "Diane, you can't do this alone," he'd said, his voice a balm of practiced sincerity that cut through her fog of panic. "David wouldn't want you to carry this enormous burden. You're the heart of this place, but he was the brain. Let me be the brain for a while. I handle finances for a living. Let me take this off your plate so you can focus on what you do best. Making magic." Relief, pure and overwhelming, washed over her so powerfully it almost brought her to her knees. Richard, with his confident smile, his air of corporate competence, his neat briefcase, was the antithesis of her own floundering grief. He was family. He had stood at the funeral and spoken eloquently of his love for his older brother. She saw him not as a businessman, but as a lifeline, a gift from the universe. "Oh, Richard," she'd sobbed, the overdue bills fluttering from her hand as she leaned into his stiff, formal hug. "I don't know what I would do. I'm failing him. I'm failing everything." He patted her back with a measured, reassuring rhythm. "Nonsense. You just need support. It's all taken care of, Diane. I've got you." As he knelt to pick up the scattered invoices, his expression was one of calm control, a general taking command of a battlefield. Diane retreated to her kitchen, the first flicker of genuine hope she'd felt in months warming her chest like a sip of hot tea. She was so grateful, so utterly relieved, that she didn't see the flicker of a different emotion in Richard's eyes, As he looked at the name on the bakery's letterhead, a cool, calculating glint of opportunity that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Richard integrated himself into the bakery's operations with a seamless, almost unnerving efficiency. He cleared a space on David's desk, setting up a sleek silver laptop that made the old wood-paneled adding machine in the corner look like a relic from a forgotten age. For Diane, his constant presence became a source of profound comfort. While she was elbow-deep in a fragrant batch of brioche dough, losing herself in the familiar, tactile world she understood, she could hear him in the office. His voice was a low, authoritative murmur on the phone, punctuated by words she didn't comprehend but found deeply reassuring. Leveraging assets, restructuring payment cycles, optimizing procurement logistics. It was the sound of control, and she craved it. Each afternoon, typically around 4 o'clock when the day's baking was done and she was at her most exhausted, he would approach her. He always carried a neat manila folder and a fancy weighted pen. "Just a few things to keep us compliant and improve our margins, Diane," he'd say with a patient, indulgent smile, as if explaining something to a child. One day, he presented a multi-page document. "This is the new vendor agreement for our flour. I found a supplier who can give us a much better price per pound, better net 60 terms, which will save us on immediate cash flow." He pointed to a highlighted line at the bottom of a page dense with impenetrable legal text. "Signature right there." Another day it was different forms. "And this one is just updating our business license with the state, a standard formality since David is no longer a listed partner. And this one," he'd add, sliding another paper over, "is to incorporate the bakery as an LLC. It's for your protection, Diane. It shields your personal assets, like the house, from any corporate liability." David was a smart man, but he was a bit old-fashioned. "This is just modern business practice." Her eyes would glaze over as she tried to read the paragraphs. The legalese blurred into an incomprehensible wall of text, and her mind, weary from grief and a long day's work, would invariably drift to the proofing schedule for tomorrow's sourdough, the rising cost of Belgian chocolate, the lingering memory of David laughing in this very room. She felt a flash of unease once, staring at the LLC conversion document. "David always read every single line of anything he signed," she murmured, a faint echo of her husband's cautious voice in her head. Richard's response was immediate and smooth. "And that's exactly why I'm here, Diane," he said, his tone softening with feigned empathy. "To take that burden off you so you don't have to spend your nights reading contracts. I'm reading every line for you, so you don't have..." It's what he would have wanted. It was the perfect counter, appealing to her exhaustion and her desire to honor her husband's memory. And so, she would sign. Her signature, once a proud, confident flourish on birthday cards and letters, became a shaky, hesitant mark on documents she didn't understand. She signed papers that terminated their contract with a local flour mill run by a family they'd known for 20 years. She signed forms that gave Richard full signatory authority on their business bank accounts, not just the ability to pay bills. She signed the LLC paperwork that, buried deep in the fine print, listed him not just as a manager, but as a managing partner with a stake in the business. Each signature felt like an act of trust, a small price to pay for the immense peace of mind he was giving her. She was so consumed by her gratitude, so shrouded in the persistent fog of her grief, that she failed to notice the subtle, crucial details. She was signing away the foundations of the life she and David had built, one grateful, unread signature at a time, believing with all her heart that she was saving it. The problems started as whispers, tiny hairline fractures in the bakery's sturdy foundation, then quickly grew into a deafening roar. For the first time in 20 years of business, an entire shipment of premium Madagascar vanilla beans, the irreplaceable, fragrant secret to her famous creme brulee tarts and vanilla bean scones, went missing in transit. The new, cheaper supplier Richard had contracted was a faceless entity in another state. After a week of navigating an automated phone tree, Diane finally spoke to a person who was apologetic but utterly unhelpful. The replacement shipment arrived 2 weeks late, forcing her to take several of her most beloved items off the menu. Customers, especially the longtime regulars, were vocal in their disappointment. A woman named Mrs. Gable, who had ordered vanilla cupcakes for her granddaughter's birthday every year for a decade, looked at Diane with pity. "Oh dear. Things seem to be slipping, don't they?" The comment, though not unkindly meant, stung like a slap. Richard just shrugged when Diane told him. "Supply chain issues," he'd said, flipping through a file without looking up. "It's happening everywhere, Diane. We just have to be nimble." A week later, on a bitterly cold Monday morning, she walked in to find the main convection oven cold and inert. The thermostat had malfunctioned over the weekend. On the racks inside sat 36 trays of carefully proofed croissant dough, now a sticky, lifeless, unrisen mess. It was a testament to over $600 in lost ingredients and a full day of meticulous labor, all down the drain. The repairman Richard called, a new company, not their trusted local guy, couldn't come for 2 days. This meant no croissants, no scones, no muffins. More lost revenue, more apologies to customers. "Bad luck," Richard sympathized, shaking his head with a convincing performance of frustration. "These old machines are a real liability. We should look into financing a new one, but our cash flow is too tight right now." The most painful blow, the one that felt like a betrayal long before she knew the real betrayal, was when Richard fired Gary. Gary, their head baker, had been with them since the very beginning. He was family, the one who had patiently taught their own son how to pipe frosting on a cupcake as a child. The official reason for his dismissal was a minor inventory error. He had miscounted a bag of almonds. It was a mistake that, in the past, would have earned a gruff but forgiving word from David and become a running joke. Richard was clinical and cruel. He called Gary into the office and, with Diane standing there helplessly, terminated his employment for a pattern of performance issues and a lack of attention to detail that we can no longer afford. "What are you talking about?" Diane had protested, following Richard back into the office after a heartbroken Gary had left. "A pattern? He made one mistake." Richard calmly opened a file folder on the desk. Inside was a log of fabricated infractions. Gary being 3 minutes late one morning, a batch of cookies slightly overbaked, a mislabeled bin of flour. All trivial, all twisted into a narrative of incompetence. "In this tight market, we can't afford sentimentalities or inefficiencies, Diane," Richard said coolly. "His performance has been slipping. We need to trim the fat to survive." The bakery's warm, cheerful atmosphere curdled. The remaining staff, small and now fearful, grew quiet and anxious. The easy camaraderie was replaced by a tense uncertainty. Maria Garcia, a bright young woman Diane had been mentoring, seemed to jump every time Richard walked through the kitchen. She witnessed Richard on the phone one afternoon, his back to the kitchen, and heard him say, "No, it's perfect. She's so overwhelmed she doesn't question a thing." When he turned and saw her, he scowled, and Maria quickly busied herself cleaning a mixer, her heart pounding. The joy was being systematically drained from the place, replaced by a creeping dread that Diane felt deep in her bones. She started losing sleep, the sweet sense of her workday replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of anxiety. When she voiced her fears to Richard, he would patiently open a spreadsheet on his laptop, pointing to charts and graphs that all trended ominously downward. "The numbers don't lie, Diane," he'd say, his face a perfect mask of concern. "We're taking on water. I'm doing everything I can to plug the holes, but it's a tough situation." He made her feel as though the bakery's struggles were an inevitability, a sad, unavoidable consequence of David's passing, rather than a series of carefully, maliciously orchestrated calamities. Richard asked her to stay after they closed on a Thursday. The request itself filled her with a sense of foreboding. The last employee had left, and the silence of the empty bakery, usually a peaceful hum after a busy day, pressed in on Diane, amplifying the frantic, panicked beat of her heart. The lights were off in the main shop, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar space feel alien and threatening. In the cramped office, Richard had his laptop open, its sterile blue light casting his face in grim, angular shadows. He didn't bother with pleasantries. His demeanor was that of a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "Diane, we need to talk," he began, his voice low and solemn. I've run the final numbers for the quarter and it's not good. It's much worse than I thought. He turned the laptop towards her. The screen was a sea of red. On it was a spreadsheet filled with columns of negative numbers, each one a nail in the coffin of her life's work. A graph to the right showed a terrifyingly steep decline, a cliff face representing their profits falling into a deep, dark canyon of debt. He began to narrate her failure, using the very incidents he had caused as his evidence. Sales are down 35%, he said, pointing to a cell. That's a direct result of the key items we've had to pull from the menu. See this spike in costs? That's the ingredients we lost when the oven went down. See this spike? This here is the severance we had to pay Gary. It's a domino effect, Diane. We're operating at a significant loss. At this rate, with our property tax payment due, we'll be in default and facing bankruptcy in less than 2 months. The words hit Diane like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Bankrupt. The word was a poison, a brand of shame. It meant failure. It meant she had taken the beautiful, thriving entity she and David had poured their souls into and had single-handedly run it into the ground. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the damning crimson figures on the screen. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking as she shook her head in denial. "No, there has to be something we can do. We can get a business loan. We can cut back on—" "We can't get a loan," Richard cut in gently, but with an air of absolute finality. "I've already explored that. With our current financials, the business is too high risk. No bank will touch us." He let the silence hang in the small office, a suffocating blanket of despair. He allowed her to absorb the full weight of her apparent failure. Then he leaned forward, adopting the tone of a reluctant, heartbroken savior. "But I may have found a lifeline. It's not what we would have wanted, not in a million years, but it's a way out. It saves you from financial ruin." He slid a glossy, professional-looking brochure across the desk. The logo at the top read, Evergreen Holdings. He explained that this private investment group had been quietly buying up small, distressed businesses in the area, primarily for their real estate assets. "They're ruthless, but they're solvent," Richard explained. "They are interested in the bakery's location and assets. They've made an offer, Diane." He slid a printed document across the desk next to the brochure. The price he quoted was shockingly, insultingly low, a fraction of what the bakery had been worth just a year ago. It felt like a pittance, a handful of dust for a lifetime of work. But as he laid out the grim alternative, foreclosure, liens, creditors seizing her equipment, and ultimately the bank coming after her personal assets, her home, the lowball offer began to transform in her mind. It was no longer an insult. It was a rescue raft in a raging sea. "They'll assume all the debt," Richard pressed, his voice soft and persuasive. "You'll walk away clean. No bankruptcy on your record. You can finally grieve, Diane. You can rest. David built this place to provide for you, not to be a millstone around your neck. He would hate seeing you this stressed, this destroyed by it all. Letting it go is the strongest thing you can do right now. It's honoring his desire to protect you." He invoked David's name, the ultimate weapon against her crumbling resolve. Heartbroken, exhausted, and utterly defeated by the mountain of fabricated evidence, Diane looked from the spreadsheet to Richard's sympathetic face. She felt she had no other choice. She was failing David's memory. Selling was the only way to stop the bleeding. "Okay," she choked out, the single word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Okay, Richard, we'll sell." The last day of Miller's Marvelous Bakes felt like a wake held in a mausoleum. The air, normally thick with the vibrant scent of life and sweetness, smelled only of bleach, cardboard, and the dust of finality. The gleaming glass display cases, which had once held tiered wedding cakes, pyramids of jewel-tone macarons, and rows of gleaming fruit tarts, stood starkly empty. They had been wiped clean of every last crumb, their emptiness a reflection of the hollow feeling in Diane's chest. She moved through the space like a ghost in her own life, carefully wrapping and packing away 35 years of memories into brown cardboard boxes. Each item she touched was a fresh stab of pain. Cardboard box. She picked up the framed photo of her and David on opening day, their faces flushed with a potent cocktail of terror and giddy excitement. They were so young, so full of dreams. She wrapped it in bubble wrap as if to protect it from the harsh reality of the present. Next came the chipped, world's best baker mug her son Michael had given her for Mother's Day when he was 7. She could still remember his proud little face. Then she found the small, worn wooden rolling pin that had belonged to her grandmother, the tool that had first introduced her to the magic of baking. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with generations of love and tradition that she was now surrendering. Richard was a whirlwind of brisk efficiency, a stark contrast to her slow, mournful pace. He directed the professional movers with a detached authority, pointing at equipment to be left for the new owners and inventory to be discarded. He was sympathetic on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of impatience to his actions, a palpable desire to get it all over with. "Just a few more boxes from the office, Diane," he'd say, placing a brief, uncomfortably firm hand on her arm. "Then you can go home and put your feet up. This is the end of a very stressful chapter." His words, meant to be comforting, felt like a complete dismissal of her entire life's work. Her small staff came by one to say their goodbyes. These were not perfunctory farewells. They were wrenching. Linda, who had worked the counter for 15 years, hugged Diane tightly, both of them sobbing quietly. "This was the best job I ever had," Linda whispered. "You and David, you were family." The raw emotion from her employees only deepened Diane's sense of failure. She had let them all down. The young baker, Maria Garcia, lingered after the others had left, nervously wiping down a stainless steel counter that was already spotless. Her dark eyes were filled with an emotion Diane couldn't quite place, a turbulent mixture of pity, guilt, and profound fear. She approached Diane twice, opening her mouth to speak, but both times Richard had walked through the kitchen and she had flinched away, busying herself with a meaningless task. Finally, as Diane was taping up her last box, Maria came close. "Mrs. Miller," she began, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry about all this." "It's not your fault, dear," Diane said, mustering a weak, watery smile. "Sometimes things just don't work out the way we plan." Maria looked as if she were wrestling with a monumental decision. She glanced nervously toward the office where Richard was on the phone, his back to them, his voice a low, confident murmur. She simply nodded, gave Diane one last, desperate-feeling hug, and hurried out the back door. By late afternoon, it was done. The keys were handed over to a nameless courier from Evergreen Holdings. Diane never even met the new owners. Richard handled the final electronic transfer of documents, his pen scratching decisively across the last signature page. "It's done," he announced, closing his laptop with a soft final thud. "It's for the best, Diane. Now you're free." Diane stood in the doorway of her empty bakery, the place that held the echo of her husband's laugh and the warmth of a million baking days. She felt no freedom. She only felt a profound, hollow emptiness. Before leaving, she walked to the front window and traced the faded gold letters of their name, Miller. It was the bitter taste of a legacy lost, a promise to David broken. She had failed him. She had failed them all. Diane walked to her car in a daze, the single box of personal mementos feeling impossibly heavy, a sarcophagus containing the heart of her life. The finality of closing the bakery door behind her was a physical shock, a jolt that ran through her entire body. She fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling so much she couldn't fit the key into the lock. As she finally managed to open the car door, she heard quick, slapping footsteps on the pavement behind her. "Mrs. Miller, wait!" It was Maria Garcia. Her face was pale and slick with a sheen of nervous sweat, her breath coming in short, ragged puffs. It was starting to drizzle, and the light rain darkened the shoulders of her thin jacket. She glanced back toward the bakery, her eyes wide with fear, as if she expected Richard to emerge at any moment. I couldn't let you leave without this," she whispered, her voice strained and urgent. She thrust a small, tightly folded piece of notebook paper into Diane's hand. Her fingers were ice cold as they brushed against Diane's. "I'm so sorry. I was afraid to say anything. He told me I'd be fired, and my family. We need the money." "But this isn't right!" Before Diane could process her frantic words or even ask what she meant, Maria turned and practically ran down the street, disappearing around the corner into the gray afternoon. Diane sank into the driver's seat, the car door still ajar. The world outside seemed to recede, muffled and distant. She stared at the crumpled, slightly damp note in her palm. It felt dangerous, radioactive. For a long, tempting moment, she considered throwing it away, crumpling it into a ball and tossing it onto the passenger floor, not wanting any more pain on a day already saturated with it. But Maria's terrified expression, the sheer bravery of her act, compelled her. With trembling fingers that felt disconnected from her body, she unfolded the cheap, lined paper. The handwriting was a rushed, slightly slanted cursive, the ink a little smeared from Maria's nervous grip. "Mrs. Miller, I have to tell you the truth. Nothing was an accident. Richard made me do it. He told me to misfile the paperwork for the vanilla shipment so it would be delayed. He said it was a necessary step to show you how vulnerable the supply chain was." Diane's breath hitched. A cold dread, far sharper and more terrifying than grief, began to creep up her spine. She remembered her frustration, her feeling of helplessness. It was manufactured. She read on, her eyes flying across the lines, her heart beginning to pound a violent, sickening rhythm against her ribs. "The oven breaking wasn't bad luck. He had me call the repair company and tell them it wasn't an emergency, so they would take longer to come. He was sabotaging you. He fired Gary for nothing. He wanted your most experienced people gone." She could see it now. Richard's feigned sympathy, the shake of his head. A performance. Each word on the paper was a key, unlocking a dark room in her memory. And then came the lines that shattered everything. "I overheard him on the phone so many times talking to his wife. He was laughing. He said you were so lost in your grief, so emotional, that you were the perfect mark, and his plan was working perfectly. He bragged about how he was driving the bakery into the ground so he could buy it for nothing." The world tilted and went silent. The air in the car grew thick and unbreathable. She was reading the words, but her brain refused to accept them. Richard? Kind, helpful Richard, who had held her as she cried? It was impossible. It had to be a mistake, a grotesque misunderstanding. But the final sentence landed like a guillotine, severing her last shred of doubt and shattering her world into a million unrecognizable pieces of jagged, poisoned glass. The company that bought the bakery, Evergreen Holdings, it's not a real investment group. It's a shell company. I saw the registration papers on his desk when he was in the bathroom. It's registered to his wife. Her name is Cynthia Miller. Cynthia. The name hung in the air, a symbol of the ultimate, intimate betrayal. Diane stared through the windshield, not seeing the rain-streaked street, but seeing a montage of her own foolishness. Every signature, every nod of gratitude, her own foolishness. Every time she had thanked him for saving her. The grief that had clouded her for months didn't just evaporate, it was incinerated in an instant, burned away by a clean, white-hot, clarifying rage. The sadness, the guilt, the crushing feeling of failure, it was all a lie. She hadn't failed David. She had been robbed by him, robbed by family, the cruelest thieves of all. A cold, razor-sharp fury propelled Diane. It was an energy so potent, it felt like electricity humming under her skin. She didn't go home to her empty house. She didn't cry. She started the car and drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her foot pressing the accelerator with a force that surprised her. The quiet, tree-lined suburban streets leading to Richard and Cynthia's upscale colonial home blurred past her. This was a house she and David had been to for countless holidays, for barbecues and birthdays. Now it looked like a viper's nest. She pulled into their perfectly manicured circular driveway, screeching to a halt behind Cynthia's gleaming silver Lexus. She didn't bother with the ornate brass doorbell. She twisted the handle and shoved the heavy front door open, striding into their immaculate two-story foyer as if she owned the place. The sound of clinking glasses and muted, self-satisfied laughter came from the formal living room to her left. She followed it, her sensible, flour-dusted shoes silent on their polished hardwood floors. There they were. Richard, his tie loosened, was holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, its gold foil catching the light. Cynthia, dressed in a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored slacks, held two crystal flutes, a triumphant smirk on her face. A silver bucket chilling the expensive champagne sat on their marble coffee table, beads of condensation running down its sides. They were celebrating their conquest. "To new beginnings," Richard was saying, his voice rich with satisfaction as he poured the bubbling liquid, "and to the profitable future of Evergreen Holdings." They looked up as Diane entered the room, their smiles freezing on their faces. Richard was the first to recover, his expression shifting with practiced speed from smugness to one of deep concern. "Diane, what on earth are you doing here? Is everything all right?" he asked, hastily setting the bottle down. "I was just unwinding after a difficult day. A sad day for the bakery, but a necessary one." Diane said nothing. She simply walked forward, her gaze locked on his, and threw Maria's crumpled note onto the coffee table. It landed with a soft, insignificant rustle next to the opulent champagne bucket. Richard glanced at it, and a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic crossed his face before he could smooth his features back into a mask of confusion. Cynthia, however, merely raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her expression one of boredom and irritation at the intrusion. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice strained, a little too high-pitched. "A confession," Diane said, her own voice dangerously calm, devoid of the tears he was used to. "From an honest employee. It explains everything, Richard. The lost vanilla, the broken oven." "It explains your very profitable future." Richard began to bluster, his face reddening in blotches. "Diane, this is absurd. You can't listen to a disgruntled employee making up lies. She's probably just angry she's out of a job." But Cynthia, arrogant and impatient, cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her eyes cold and appraising as she looked Diane up and down, from her sensible shoes to her grief-worn face. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Richard, stop pretending," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "She was going to run it into the ground anyway. Honestly, Diane, you should be thanking us. David was sweet, but he had no ambition, no vision. Thanking us. He was content with being a small-time baker. We're finally unlocking the real potential of that property. She was too emotional to run a business after he died. We did her a favor, really. We rescued the asset before she destroyed it completely." The admission hung in the air, more damning than any signature on a fraudulent document, more powerful than any written confession. The casual, breathtaking cruelty of it, the utter lack of remorse, confirmed the entire rotten scheme. Richard stared at his wife, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. He had been caught, not by a clever lawyer or a diligent investigator, but by his own wife's unrestrained, narcissistic pride. Diane looked from his stunned, guilty face to Cynthia's smug one. The rage inside her solidified into something hard and unbreakable as steel. "A favor?" she repeated, her voice low and trembling not with weakness, but with tightly controlled fury. "Thank you, Cynthia. You've just confirmed everything. I wasn't sure I could prove your intent. Now I can." She turned her back on them and their stolen celebration. "You didn't do me a favor. You just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The next morning, Diane didn't wallow in her anger. She channeled it. She didn't call Richard to scream or plead. She called a lawyer. Evelyn Reed was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s whose calm, measured demeanor belied a fierce, predatory intelligence in the courtroom. She listened to Diane's entire story in her quiet, book-lined office, her gaze never wavering. She reviewed Maria's note, her expression hardening as Diane recounted Cynthia's arrogant, damning confession. When Diane finished, her story hanging in the quiet air of the office, Evelyn gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The note is our start," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "But the live testimony from this young woman, Maria, is what will hammer the nails in their coffin." With Evelyn's professional reassurance and a promise of legal protection, a terrified but resolute Maria Garcia agreed to give a formal statement to the authorities. That, combined with the clear, damning trail of deceit Evelyn's forensic accountant quickly and easily uncovered, was more than enough. The paperwork Diane had so trustingly signed was a perfect, self-incriminating roadmap of Richard's fraud. The hasty incorporation of the new LLC, the transfer of key assets, the sale to a shell company owned by his wife for a fraction of its market value, it was a classic, and as Evelyn noted, a remarkably clumsy, arrogant conspiracy. Faced with irrefutable financial evidence, Maria's damning testimony, and the recorded confession of a private investigator Diane hired to discuss the sale with Cynthia one more time, Richard and Cynthia's celebratory bubble burst with spectacular divorce. They were arrested and charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. The community was scandalized. The story of the grieving widow, a beloved local figure, being systematically cheated by her own family, became front-page news. The subsequent wave of support for Diane was overwhelming and humbling. People she hadn't seen in years stopped her on the street to offer support. A local newspaper ran a series of articles championing her cause. Volunteers, including old staff and loyal customers, offered to help her clean and prepare the bakery for reopening, refusing any payment. The court moved swiftly. The fraudulent sale to Evergreen Holdings was declared null and void. Richard and Cynthia, stripped of their veneer of suburban respectability, tried to fight but were buried under the avalanche of evidence. In the courtroom, Richard was a pathetic, broken figure. Cynthia remained defiant and contemptuous to the end. It didn't matter. They were found guilty on all counts. Richard received a significant prison sentence for orchestrating the fraud, his life of comfort and privilege exchanged for a small, concrete cell. Cynthia was given 5 years of probation and ordered to pay massive financial restitution for her role as a co-conspirator, forcing the sale of her Lexus, their house, and all their assets. 3 months later, a new banner hung proudly over the entrance to the bakery, its bright red letters proclaiming, "Miller's Marvelous Bakes, Grand Reopening." The place was packed, a line snaking out the door and down the sidewalk, bigger than any they'd had before. Old customers and new faces, all aware of Diane's story, crowded the shop, their very presence a vote of confidence. The air was once again thick and glorious with the comforting smells of cinnamon, almond, melting chocolate, and fresh coffee. It wasn't easy. The bakery was still climbing out of the debt Richard had manufactured, and the legal battles had been draining. But this time, it was different. Diane was different. She stood behind the counter, a clean, crisp apron tied around her waist, a genuine, tired but triumphant smile on her face. Maria Garcia, promoted to assistant manager, worked happily beside her, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet, well-earned confidence. Diane had even added a new item to the menu, Maria's courageous croissants, which were selling out every morning. Later that night, long after the last happy customer had left, Diane stood alone in the quiet of her bakery. She looked around at the bustling shop, at the proof of her own resilience. She walked over to the wall and straightened the framed photo of her and David. She looked at his smiling face, and this time there was no guilt, no sense of failure. There was only a quiet, peaceful love. She had faced the worst kind of betrayal, and had not only survived, but emerged stronger, smarter, and more capable than she had ever imagined. The smudge of flour on her cheek was no longer a mark of grief, but a badge of honor, a symbol of a life she had fought for and won back. She was in control, honoring David's memory not by succumbing to loss, but by building on their shared dream with her own 2 very capable hands.